It didn't begin with outrage. It didn't begin with division. It began with something much quieter, admiration that felt almost universal. In a time where nearly every public figure is quickly pulled into one side of the cultural battlefield or the other, Alysa Liu somehow existed outside of that gravity. She wasn't just respected for her talent. She was embraced from all angles, celebrated in spaces that rarely agree on anything. That kind of crossover appeal doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a person becomes more than just themselves, when they become a symbol people can shape to fit their own beliefs. For a long time, Alysa Liu was exactly that kind of symbol. Her performances on the ice were precise, controlled, and deeply expressive, but they also carried something else, an absence of noise. She didn't skate like someone trying to send a message. She didn't perform like someone trying to prove a point. She simply showed up, delivered, and left the rest to interpretation. And that blank space, the space where commentary could have been, became the reason she was embraced so widely. Different audiences saw different things in her. Some saw discipline, structure, and the reward of hard work. Others saw independence, authenticity, and a refusal to be boxed in. And because Alysa never rushed to define herself publicly in political terms, both sides felt comfortable claiming a piece of her story. That's where the foundation was built, not on what she said, but on what she didn't say. Over time, that silence turned into something powerful. It created a version of Alysa Liu that existed in multiple forms at once. On one side, she was framed as a symbol of traditional excellence, someone who proved that focus and commitment still mattered in a world that often celebrates shortcuts. On the other side, she was seen as a representation of a new generation, fearless, self-directed, and uninterested in fitting into old molds. These two narratives didn't clash at first. They coexisted because neither one had been directly challenged. But there's a hidden tension in that kind of universal approval. When everyone feels like they understand you, it often means no one actually does. It means people are connecting more with their idea of you than with who you really are. And that gap, the space between perception and reality, doesn't stay stable forever. Eventually, something fills it. For Alysa Liu, that something had been building quietly in the background. Interviews, small comments, subtle shifts in tone. Nothing explosive, nothing headline-worthy, but enough to suggest that there was more beneath the surface than what people had been projecting onto her. Still, those signals were easy to ignore. As long as the performances stayed strong and the public image stayed calm, most people didn't look any deeper. But curiosity has a way of growing when it isn't satisfied. The more Alysa avoided being defined, the more people wanted to define her. Questions started forming, not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. Who is she beyond the ice? What does she actually think about the world around her? Is her silence intentional, or is it just a byproduct of focus? That's the kind of curiosity that doesn't explode, it tightens. It builds pressure without making a sound. And when the moment finally comes where that pressure is released, it doesn't just create noise. It creates a shift. That moment arrived with the Rolling Stone interview. At first, it didn't feel like a turning point. Athletes do interviews all the time, and most of them follow a predictable pattern: background, achievements, challenges, future goals. There's a rhythm to it, a structure that keeps things safe and controlled. But Rolling Stone isn't known for staying inside those lines. It has a reputation for going deeper, for asking the questions that don't always have clean answers. Even then, expectations were mixed. Some people assumed the interview would reinforce what they already believed about Alysa Liu. Others thought it might reveal something new. But almost no one expected it to disrupt the narrative as quickly as it did. The beginning of the interview felt familiar. Alysa spoke about her journey, her relationship with skating, the pressures that come with competing at a high level. Her tone was calm, reflective, and grounded. There was no immediate sign of controversy, no hint that anything was about to shift. If you stopped reading there, you would have walked away with the same impression you had before: talented, focused, composed. But as the conversation went deeper, something changed. The questions became more personal, less about what she does and more about how she sees. And Alysa's answers began to open up in a way that hadn't been fully visible before. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but undeniably honest. She started to speak about expectations, not just the pressure to perform, but the pressure to fit into narratives that others had created for her. That's where the tone shifted. Because once she acknowledged that those narratives existed, it became impossible to pretend they didn't matter. And once she began to push back against them, even subtly, it changed how people interpreted everything else she said. It wasn't one line that triggered the reaction. It wasn't a single quote that could be pulled out and labeled as controversial. It was the accumulation of her perspective, the overall message that she was more complex than the simplified image that had been built around her. And for some people, that complexity felt like a contradiction. Clips from the interview started circulating almost immediately. Short excerpts, stripped of context, began appearing across social media. Each one carried a slightly different meaning depending on who was sharing it. Some framed her words as empowering, a sign that she was stepping fully into her own voice. Others framed them as disappointing, suggesting that she had moved away from what they believed she represented. And because most people encountered the interview through those fragments, not the full conversation, those interpretations spread faster than the original message. That's when the shift became visible. What had once been admiration started turning into debate. People who had supported her began questioning her, not necessarily because she had said something extreme, but because she had said something that didn't align with their expectations. And when expectations are strong enough, even a small deviation can feel like a complete reversal. At the same time, another group of voices grew louder in her defense. They argued that Alysa Liu hadn't changed at all, that she was simply being seen more clearly for the first time. According to them, the real issue wasn't what she said, but how much people had projected onto her before she said it. That divide didn't happen slowly. It happened almost overnight. Within hours, the conversation had shifted from celebration to analysis. Within a day, it had turned into a full-scale online discussion, with people dissecting her words, her tone, even her pauses. Every detail became part of the narrative, every interpretation adding another layer to the story. And at the center of it all was a question that didn't have a simple answer. Did Alysa Liu actually change, or did people just realize they never really understood her in the first place? That question is what made the moment feel bigger than just an interview. Because it wasn't only about her. It was about the way public figures are perceived, the way audiences build identities for them, and the way those identities can collapse the moment reality doesn't match the expectation. Alysa Liu didn't suddenly step into controversy. She stepped out of ambiguity. And for a lot of people, that felt like the same thing. What makes this even more complicated is that her tone never became aggressive. She didn't attack anyone. She didn't try to provoke. If anything, she remained consistent, calm, thoughtful, measured. But clarity has a different kind of impact than silence. Silence allows people to imagine. Clarity forces them to confront. And not everyone is comfortable with that. In the days that followed, reactions became more defined. Some voices doubled down on their criticism, arguing that she had alienated part of her audience. Others pushed back just as strongly, saying that expecting an athlete to remain neutral forever was unrealistic to begin with. And somewhere in between were people trying to understand what had actually happened, recognizing that the situation wasn't as simple as it was being portrayed. Through all of this, Alysa Liu didn't immediately respond to the noise. And that silence, once again, became part of the story. But this time, it didn't feel neutral. It felt charged, like a pause in the middle of something still unfolding. Because the truth is, moments like this don't end when the interview is over. They continue in the reactions, in the conversations, in the way people adjust their understanding of what they thought they knew. And in that sense, the Rolling Stone interview didn't just change how people saw Alysa Liu. It revealed how much of what they saw before had never really been her at all. The reaction didn't slow down after the first wave, it accelerated. What started as scattered opinions quickly turned into something more organized, more deliberate, almost like people were choosing sides in a situation that, just days earlier, didn't even feel like a conflict. That's how fast perception can shift when a public figure steps outside the version of them that people have grown comfortable with. At first, it looked like a typical online cycle. A few viral clips, some strong opinions, a burst of commentary that would normally fade within a day or two. But this didn't fade. It deepened. The more people talked about Alysa Liu's interview, the more layers they seemed to find in it. Some real, some imagined, and some completely shaped by the biases of the person interpreting them. What made it different this time was how personal it felt to so many people. It wasn't just about what she said, it was about what people thought she represented before she said it. That emotional investment turned a simple interview into something much bigger. For some, it felt like a betrayal. For others, it felt like a long overdue moment of honesty. And in between those reactions was something even more revealing. The realization that Alysa Liu had never actually agreed to be the symbol people had made her into. That's where the conversation started to shift in a more serious way. Instead of just reacting to individual quotes, people began analyzing the broader pattern. They revisited older interviews, past performances, even small moments that had once seemed insignificant. Suddenly, everything was being reinterpreted through this new lens, as if the Rolling Stone interview had unlocked a version of her that had always been there, just not fully understood. Some argued that the signs had been obvious all along, that people had simply ignored them because they preferred a cleaner, more convenient narrative. Others pushed back, insisting that the interview marked a genuine shift, a point where Alysa chose to step into a more defined public identity. That disagreement created a second wave of discussion, one that wasn't just about Alysa Liu, but about how audiences interact with public figures in general. Why do people feel so certain about someone they've never met? Why does a single interview have the power to reshape years of perception? The answer, in many ways, comes down to projection. For a long time, Alysa Liu had been a blank canvas in certain areas. Not completely undefined, but undefined enough for people to fill in the gaps with their own beliefs. That's a powerful position to be in, but it's also unstable. Because the moment you start to define yourself, even slightly, you risk breaking the illusion that made you universally appealing in the first place. And that's exactly what happened here. As more clips circulated, the tone of the conversation became sharper. The same words were being used in completely different ways depending on who was speaking. One group would highlight a quote as evidence of independence and self-awareness. Another would take that same quote and frame it as a rejection of values they thought she represented. The content hadn't changed, but the interpretation had. This is where the role of media amplification became impossible to ignore. Headlines started appearing that simplified the situation into something more dramatic than it actually was. Phrases like "changed everything overnight" or "unexpected shift" began to dominate the narrative, even though the reality was far more nuanced. But nuance doesn't spread as fast as conflict. And so the story kept growing, not necessarily because new information was being added, but because the existing information was being reshaped, repeated, and sometimes distorted. Each retelling made it feel bigger, more intense, more decisive than it really was. At the same time, a quieter conversation was happening beneath the surface, one that didn't rely on viral clips or dramatic headlines. It was a conversation about identity, about control, and about the pressure that comes with being seen by millions of people who all think they understand you. In that space, Alysa Liu's interview started to look less like a controversy and more like a boundary. Not a loud, aggressive boundary, but a clear one. She wasn't trying to start a debate. She wasn't trying to provoke a reaction. If anything, she was doing something much simpler, speaking in her own voice without adjusting it to fit what others expected. And ironically, that simplicity is what made the reaction so intense. Because when people are used to interpreting you, hearing you define yourself can feel like a disruption. That disruption continued to ripple outward. Commentators who had previously praised her began reevaluating their stance. Some did it cautiously, softening their language but still expressing uncertainty. Others were more direct, openly stating that they felt misled or disappointed. On the other side, supporters became more vocal, defending her right to express herself without being boxed into a specific narrative. The middle ground started to shrink. And as that happened, the conversation became less about understanding and more about positioning. People weren't just asking what Alysa Liu meant. They were asking what her words meant for them, for their perspective, for their sense of alignment. That's when the situation stopped being about a single interview and started becoming a reflection of something larger. It reflected how quickly admiration can turn into expectation, how easily expectation can turn into pressure, and how that pressure can create a version of a person that feels real, even when it isn't. Through all of this, one detail remained consistent. Alysa Liu herself didn't escalate the situation. She didn't respond with counterstatements. She didn't try to correct every interpretation. She allowed the conversation to unfold without stepping directly into it. That decision had its own impact. For some, it reinforced the idea that she was staying true to herself, refusing to be pulled into unnecessary conflict. For others, it created more uncertainty, more space for speculation. In the absence of direct clarification, people continued to fill in the gaps on their own. And those gaps kept the story alive. Days passed, but the conversation didn't disappear. It evolved. It moved from quick reactions to deeper analysis. Articles began to explore not just what she said, but why it mattered. Discussions expanded beyond Alysa Liu and into the broader topic of how athletes are perceived, how they're expected to behave, and what happens when they step outside those expectations. In that sense, the interview had already done something significant. It had forced a conversation that people didn't even realize they needed to have. Because at its core, this wasn't just about politics or perception, it was about ownership. Who gets to define a public figure? The audience or the individual themselves? For a long time, it had felt like the answer was somewhere in between. But moments like this push that balance in a new direction. They remind people that no matter how widely supported someone is, that support doesn't give anyone control over who they are. And that realization can be uncomfortable, especially when it comes suddenly, especially when it challenges something people thought was stable. By the end of the week, the intensity had started to settle, but the impact remained. Opinions had been formed, positions had been taken, and the version of Alysa Liu that existed in the public mind had shifted, whether people wanted it to or not. But even then, one question continued to linger. Not about what she said, not about how people reacted, but about what comes next. Because once a perception changes, it rarely goes back to what it was before. It moves forward, reshaped by what has been revealed. And in this case, what had been revealed wasn't something dramatic or extreme. It was something much simpler and much harder to control. It was clarity. And clarity, once it's seen, doesn't disappear. By the time the noise began to settle, something fundamental had already changed. Not in a loud, explosive way, but in a quiet, irreversible one. The kind of shift that doesn't need constant headlines to prove it happened. The kind that lingers in how people think, how they interpret, how they watch going forward. Because once a perception breaks, it doesn't go back to its original form. In the days after the peak of the reaction, the conversation around Alysa Liu didn't disappear. It transformed. The intensity faded, but the awareness remained. People weren't arguing as loudly anymore, but they were paying closer attention. Every new appearance, every small comment, every public moment carried a different weight now. Not because she had changed dramatically, but because the audience had. That's the part most people don't notice. When something like this happens, the focus usually stays on the individual, what they said, what they meant, whether they crossed a line or stayed within it. But the deeper shift happens in the audience, in how they process what they see, in how quickly they move from admiration to analysis. And Alysa Liu was now being analyzed, not just as an athlete, but as a person with a perspective. That distinction matters. Before the interview, her identity in the public space was streamlined, clean, focused, centered almost entirely around performance. There was room for interpretation, but that interpretation stayed comfortable because it wasn't being directly challenged. Now, that comfort was gone. In its place was something more complex, less predictable, and far more real. Some people adjusted to that quickly. They accepted the shift, embraced it even, seeing it as a natural evolution. To them, Alysa Liu hadn't lost anything. She had gained dimension. She was no longer just a figure to admire from a distance. She was someone speaking from within her own experience, defining herself instead of being defined. But not everyone moved in that direction. There were still those who held on to the earlier version of her, the simpler version, the one that fit neatly into a specific narrative. For them, the change didn't feel like growth. It felt like a departure. And even if they couldn't point to a single statement that justified that feeling, the difference was enough to create distance. That's how perception works when it's built on expectation. It doesn't need a clear reason to shift. It just needs something that feels different. And what Alysa Liu had introduced wasn't controversy. It was individuality without translation. She wasn't adjusting her voice to match the audience anymore. She was letting it exist as it was. And that subtle shift created a gap between who people thought she was and who she actually is. That gap is where everything changed. As the conversation matured, more thoughtful perspectives began to emerge. Instead of focusing on whether her words were right or wrong, people started asking better questions. Why had so many different groups felt so connected to her in the first place? What does it say about the culture when an athlete becomes a symbol without ever choosing to be one? And what happens when that symbol starts to speak in a way that doesn't align perfectly with the image that's been created? Those questions didn't have easy answers, but they revealed something important. They revealed that the situation was never really about Alysa Liu taking a side. It was about people realizing that she was never on their side in the way they assumed. She wasn't a representation of a movement or an ideology. She was an individual navigating her own path, one that didn't need to fit neatly into existing categories. And that realization forced a kind of reset, not just in how she was seen, but in how audiences approach public figures more broadly. It exposed the tendency to simplify, to categorize, to turn complex individuals into symbols that can be easily understood and shared. And it showed how fragile those symbols are when they're based more on assumption than on reality. For Alysa Liu, this moment became something more than just a media cycle. It became a line between two phases of her public presence. Before, she existed in a space of projection. After, she existed in a space of definition. That doesn't mean everything about her changed. Her approach to skating, her focus, her discipline, those elements remained consistent. But they were now being viewed through a different lens. Instead of being seen as universally agreeable traits, they were part of a larger, more complete identity. One that included thoughts, perspectives, and boundaries that weren't always visible before. And that made her presence feel different, more grounded, more intentional, but also less predictable. That unpredictability is what unsettles people the most. Not because it's negative, but because it removes the sense of control that audiences often feel when they believe they understand someone. When that control disappears, so does the comfort that comes with it. And yet, there's something valuable in that discomfort. It creates space for a more honest connection, one that isn't based on assumptions, but on reality. One that allows a public figure to exist as a full person, not just a reflection of what others want to see. That's where Alysa Liu's story moves beyond the interview. Because the real impact wasn't in the headlines or the reactions. It was in the shift toward authenticity, even if that authenticity came with a cost. Even if it meant losing some of the universal approval that had once defined her public image. But that loss isn't as simple as it seems. Because what replaces it isn't necessarily smaller, it's just different. Instead of broad, surface-level support, there's a deeper, more specific kind of respect. The kind that doesn't depend on agreement, but on recognition. Recognition of someone choosing to be clear about who they are, even when that clarity complicates how they're perceived. That kind of respect doesn't always trend. It doesn't always go viral, but it lasts longer. As time moved forward, the intensity of the moment continued to fade, but its effect stayed embedded in how Alysa Liu was discussed, how she was followed, how she was understood. The conversation didn't end. It just became quieter, more reflective, less reactive. And in that quieter space, the original question began to feel less urgent. Did she change? Or did people just realize they never fully understood her? Because at that point, the answer mattered less than the outcome. The outcome was clear. She was no longer being viewed through a single, shared narrative. She was being seen from multiple angles, with all the complexity that comes with that. And while that made her harder to categorize, it also made her more real. In a world that often pushes public figures toward extremes, either fully aligned or completely rejected, Alysa Liu ended up in a different place. Not in the center, not on a side, but outside the framework entirely. And that's not a comfortable position, but it's an honest one. The kind that doesn't rely on being understood by everyone. The kind that doesn't require universal approval to exist. And maybe that's what changed everything. Not the interview itself, not the reactions that followed, but the quiet, undeniable shift from being a symbol people could shape to being a person who defines herself. And once that shift happens, there's no going back, only forward.